website. And yeah, with that, we can get started. Sean, do you want to just like briefly introduce yourself? Maybe tell us about jobs you've had before and after BC and what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. First of all, I'm always happy to talk to, BC students and IS majors in particular. As you said, I graduated in 2015. Had a Russian minor. I was always kind of interested in that part of the world. But I initially didn't know really what I was going to do after graduation. I sort of knew I wanted to be in DC. And long story short, we could talk about how this happened, but I ended up at a small political consulting firm called Blue Star Strategies, which has clients both in the private sector and public sector, working with a lot of clients in Europe. For instance, in Ukraine, we were trying to, for instance, increase congressional support to Ukraine. And that was, I worked there first as a paid intern the fall after my graduation, and then I was hired as an associate and worked there for about a year. So that was a really great experience, and aligned with some of my interests in Russia and European relations. But I also decided it wasn't quite for me. And I'd always had this passion for writing, and long story short, started to explore opportunities in the media space and ended up at the American Interest, which was a small political and foreign policy magazine, which Francis Fukuyama actually founded in 2005. I started there as a staff writer for the online version, stayed there for a little over 3 years, and basically kind of worked my way up a little bit and became assistant editor and then associate editor. So that's the broad overview. So yeah, happy to take it from there.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing. So you mentioned that you had a paid internship after graduation. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you approached the job internship search during your senior year, and if you have like any do's and don'ts for that process?
Yeah, sure. First, I feel like my experience should be like reassuring in a certain sense, and that I didn't have a job lined up at graduation and so some of you might even be ahead of me, but I initially wanted to do a Fulbright after senior year, and I applied for one in Russia. It didn't work out. I applied for this other job in Boston at a sort of think tank research center. Got to the final stage there. That didn't work out. And then I just decided, ultimately, I want to put my degree to good use. I want to do something in international relations. And I think that means I wanted to be in DC. And so, I just started talking to professors at BC, both within IS and some others I had known who had some DC connections. And if there's one, takeaway, I would say really do try to talk to professors in office hours and see if they have relevant connections. Because in my case, Professor Martha Bayless, who was a professor of mine from freshman year in the honors program at BC, knew a lot of people in DC and was willing to kind of connect me via email. And I did a bunch of informational interviews. And that's another takeaway is really do be open to doing informational interviews. It might seem like it's, if there's not an explicit job opening, what's the use? But in fact, a lot of my, the opportunities I had the summer and fall after graduation came from those connections. So one person that this professor connected me with, Jeff Gedman, later introduced me to someone at Blue Star Strategies, which was the firm I ended up interning at and then got hired at. He also later, funnily enough, became my editor at the American Interest a couple years later. So DC is a very small town. And I find that if you have connections at BC who are plugged in at all, one connection can really lead to another. And kind of relatedly to that, I was given the advice to actually go down to DC for a couple of days towards the end of the semester, sort of before its finals started, and got to actually meet some of these people in person just for a coffee, informational interviews. And again, that really paid off for me in a big way. So I had an informational interview at Blue Star Strategies. At the time, they didn't have any openings for interns, but then a couple months later, they were looking for someone for the fall and reached out to me again. And, I got hired in that role. So obviously that looks a little different in the pandemic. People might not be traveling, meeting in person, but the fact that you can meet with people easily over Zoom in some ways makes it easier. So I would just really encourage you to tap into the BC network, to talk to professors, and and see who they might introduce you to. And in my experience, BC grads in particular really want to help out fellow BC students. You might not get a informational interview with Tony Blinken at the State Department or something, but you might be able to find someone who's a BC grad who's working at state, at a lower level, or at a think tank or whatever it may be. So I really encourage you to use the BC network.
Thank you. That's really good advice. Sort of thinking about like your time at BC and how that impacted your job search. One thing we were wondering is what skills did you learn at BC that you think most helped you in the jobs that you've had? And are there any skills that you wish you had maybe worked on or developed more before you graduated?
Yeah, so I definitely think, my like writing and research skills were top of the list for me. I think BC does a very good job of teaching those skills, and IS in particular. Even taking research methods, or for me, I ended up writing a thesis for IS, and those skills really do set you apart. I think you might be surprised how rare it is to find people who can write well, and it's not just for jobs like I had at the magazine where I was an editor, but at Blue Star, the consulting firm, just the ability to kind of synthesize information, write clear and concise memos, that sort of thing really gets noticed, and can really set you apart. I would also say language skills. So obviously I know that's part of the IS curriculum. For me, having focused on Russian was certainly helpful. I think it's helpful if you can show a dedicated interest to a particular language or region, again, to kind of set you apart from the pack. And then in terms of skills, I wish I developed more. I go back and forth on this one, but arguably certain like quantitative skills. It's really helpful that econ is part of the IS curriculum. I didn't take stats as an undergrad, and I thought maybe that would have been useful. But on the other hand, I didn't take it in part because I knew that if I went back to grad school, I'd take it then, and it never really held me back in terms of the jobs I had. It wasn't something that I needed to know. So individual experience may vary, but that's what I'd say.
Okay, great, thank you. For those of us who don't really know what consulting is, or like it's just like it seems like a vague and intimidating term, could you describe a little bit more about what you did while at Blue Star Strategies?
Yeah, I sometimes don't even know what it is, really. That's the secret. And technically this firm was called like a government affairs firm, which is in some ways kind of like a euphemism for lobbying. But it entails a bunch of different things. So for instance, there were some clients who were American companies, looking to maybe break into a new market. And I helped conduct some like market research into there was one company that was looking at an opportunity in Kazakhstan, and so I was doing research on, okay, what kind of like market protections does Kazakhstan have? Is this a good idea or not? Are investments secure? That kind of thing. So a lot of I was doing some of the sort of like in-house research on that stuff. I wasn't at all like flying around to people and doing the stereotypical consulting thing with like PowerPoints and increasing profitability or any of that. I was more in-house, just kind of providing some research support. And then there were also projects that involved sort of lobbying on Capitol Hill. Like I mentioned, we were part of a consortium that was trying to increase like U.S. aid to Ukraine. This was a year or two after the start of the war there, and so we, with a kind of coalition of other private sector firms and Ukraine advocates, we were sort of trying to meet with members and build a constituency there. Again, I coming in on the lower end, I wasn't doing a lot of the public facing like stuff there, but I did have some real opportunities to kind of with the in-house research, and as I mentioned, the kind of the Russian language skill in my case was very useful, and probably is why I got that opportunity, because we're doing projects related to Ukraine and Latvia and lots of parts of the world kind of bordering on Russia. So
That's really helpful. I know I personally am always a little confused about what consulting means. So it's nice to hear like what it actually consists of in one job position.
Yeah.
So pivoting a little bit more towards your time with the American interest, we were wondering for students interested in like writing or publishing, editing, that sort of thing, what did a typical day look like for you there?
Yeah. So that question really depends, and wasn't just depending on the day, but I had a couple different roles there, so I can kind of walk you through a little bit. So I was hired as a staff writer, and at the time we had um, paid a lot of attention to our online presence, and we had this daily blog that was sort of run by this guy Walter Russell Mead. He's a Wall Street Journal kind of foreign policy pundit, and he had a sort of small team of like young staff writers who were working with him. And I was basically on the foreign policy beat doing Asia stuff. And what that meant was we were sort of looking every day at the news in the region, and then talking about what's our analysis of this trend. So we'd try to follow developments in the South China Sea or tensions with Japan or whatever, and try to pick out like the essence of the news, but then add our own analysis to it and do it in this sort of pithy blog form. So that was a pretty, that job had a pretty regular clip. We were trying to do I was trying to do like 2 posts a day. Sometimes that was fairly quick, and then I'd have free time and I could work on other writing projects sort of under my own byline. And I wrote a couple pieces about Ukraine. But that was the first job. But then, long story short, Walter left the magazine. I became an editor, and that involved more, less doing my own daily writing and more kind of commissioning other scholars and writers to write longer form essays. We'd be trying to follow kind of long-term foreign policy trends and then figure out who's the best person who can write this for us. We also had a print magazine, and I got involved with that, trying to doing some of the layout and the shaping of the print magazine. And we have a podcast. We had a podcast. I was a chief editor on that. So in that role, I was kind of was wearing many hats. And then later, there was another kind of leadership change, and the new editor wanted to kind of diversify the magazine in a lot of ways, to do more culture stuff, which I was really passionate about. I was a arts editor at the Heights, and I'm a huge movie guy, and I wanted to see if we could, not just be a straightforward political magazine and do some other culture stuff. And he kind of gave me some running room to build up a culture section, get some newer, younger writers on board. So frankly, it wasn't just a bunch of like old white guys. And we also started doing some more like public event programming. So I did like this film series where we would kind of screen an interesting politically relevant film and try to build buzz for the magazine in that way, with a guest speaker, that sort of thing. So, it really was a great job, in that it was, a small enough place that I felt I could have an impact, and the day-to-day did vary to some extent based on, the different positions I had.
Okay, great. That sounds so great. It sounds like you got to use like a lot of different skills that you gained while at BC, like with your job, and like you had a lot of space to be creative. And so I guess you're just wondering, like you went from consulting to like writing and publishing, and I've heard that publishing can be like a difficult industry to break into. So like how did you go about like switching sectors in your career, and like did the connections that you had in DC help you with that?
Yeah, definitely. And my experience is a little bit unusual, right? This is a magazine that was kind of largely funded by one person who, it wasn't like there was that kind of pressure to turn a profit that you get at other places, and that's really reshaping the industry. In my case, it was BC connections in large part. Again, one of this professor I had, Professor Bayless, was a writer for the magazine and kind of alerted me to, hey, there's an opening here. At the time, I was I was at Blue Star, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to make a change. In part, there's always that uncertainty, and but I decided to explore it, and I had already, a month or two prior, decided, I kind of miss writing for its own sake, and I had met with an editor there just to talk about doing some freelance pieces. So I already knew him a little bit, and then there was a job opening, and I got this BC professor to sort of vouch for me. So lessons from that, again, as I was saying, the BC connections can really pay off. And also, I would just say, don't be afraid to, kind of switch gears if you feel that that's what you want to do. I definitely had hesitation about, leaving a job I was already pretty, ensconced in and hadn't even been at for that long. But I sort of knew I wanted to make a change, and you know, don't feel stuck too early in your career, I would say, because there's always, more opportunities, and you shouldn't close doors prematurely.
Sounds like Professor Bayless has been a really good mentor for you throughout the years. And I actually have her for a class right
Definitely.
now, which is funny.
Oh,
Um,
cool. Tell her I say hi. Yeah.
I will. But yeah, kind of on that note, we were wondering, how have you found like mentors throughout your career, and do you have any advice for like building those relationships?
Yeah, it's kind of in line with, what I've said before, but definitely, just try to, meet people for a coffee, like it doesn't just have to be, BC connections, but in my experience, one thing kind of leads to another. Um, and generally people that you reach out to, if you're interested in their career or their work, like they'll be flattered and they'll want to talk and get out of the office and have a coffee. Um, and that can lead to some really good, mentoring relationships. I'll say also, I benefited again from being at a very small institution. I mean, the American Interest was like, I could count on two hands the number of people who work there. So you inevitably get some level of attention from, the editor in chief, or like my um, kind of supervisor, Demir, who's become a good friend, but he was a really good mentor for me. Um, so I can't, I'm not as sure about like bigger organizations, what that looks like. But for me, definitely the kind of smaller workplace, I feel like I benefit from that.
Great. So now you're pursuing your master's in international affairs at Columbia. So like, how did you decide to take that step, and like, how did you see it advancing your career?
Yeah, I definitely had been thinking about grad school for a while, but wasn't sure why I wanted to go in some sense. I didn't want to go to school just to go to grad school. Um, but I think I ultimately decided, for a couple of years in DC, kind of doing the media thing, and I'd been in on this, this small like consulting firm, but I hadn't really done anything that was directly like policy relevant. And I think I want to ultimately work in the government and like on policy making in some capacity. Um, and I think there are a lot of really good policy schools that offer masters that are specifically focused on policy making, and they're like practitioner focused rather than trying to create future academics or IR theorists. So I kind of decided, okay, I think that's what I want to do, right? I want to sharpen some of my like skill sets, ultimately come back in a couple of years and try and work for the government. And for me, you probably familiar with schools like Johns Hopkins SAIS, Georgetown School for Foreign Service, um, Stanford's got a good policy school. I was looking at a bunch of those, but Columbia ultimately kind of spoke to me because I wanted to do international security policy, and the faculty they had there were very strong. A lot of top theorists, but also really experienced practitioners. They also had a strong focus on Russia and the post-Soviet space. They have this regional center, the Harriman Institute, which, for my purposes and given my interest, it was kind of a natural fit, where I could do the policy curriculum, but also take courses across Columbia's other graduate schools, including in the more regionally focused stuff. So that's basically that's the decision. Kind of sharpen like the policy skill sets, ultimately go back and work in the government.
Cool. And obviously, I know it's probably been strange because of COVID, as is everything this year. But like, what has grad school been like so far? What parts do you like? What parts do you maybe not like as much? I'm sure we'd all be curious to hear a little more about it.
Yeah, I should say I've done this whole like first year remotely, so it's weird year, pandemic. I'm back at home. I'm not in New York, but it has been really good. I would say, for one thing, it's teaching me how well BC prepared me, because there are some courses, like there's a core class like foundations of international, I forget what it's called, but it's a lot like the intro to IS course, slightly different readings and that sort of thing, but I felt like very well prepared for that. Similarly, we take, micro and macroeconomics, probably at like a slightly higher level than BC offered, more policy focused directly, but I felt very well prepared by the IS curriculum for that. In terms of like, workload, social life, that kind of thing at grad school, again, it's hard to talk about that since I've only done it virtually, but there are opportunities for socializing even virtually and for extracurriculars. I'm involved with this Journal of International Affairs, which is this like foreign policy journal run by Columbia. I'm an editor there, and so I have these kind of weekly meetings with other people. It's all student run, so I get to meet people through that. I've gotten involved with the Harriman Institute, which again is about kind of Russia focused center, and met some students and peers through that. And there are courses that are smaller seminars, so it's not like you're just one tiny little Zoom box, anonymous, doing school from home. You do get to meet professors and have office hours with them and have good relationships with them. So yeah, it's been very positive for me so far.
That's great to hear. So before we open up for questions from everybody else on the call, I was just wondering if you had like any other advice that you haven't already mentioned for BC students in their job search or grad school search, or like anything else that they should do while they're still in school.
Yeah, let me I'm probably just like a broken record. I just don't be afraid to kind of reach out to other people in your BC network. Don't be afraid to ask for informational interviews. You never know what that can lead to, and in my case it really did open some doors. And don't be discouraged. As I said, I didn't have a job at graduation. I ended up like moving to DC. I had like an unpaid part-time internship, and then I was like working at a movie theater for a little bit. So it just goes to show that like you might not have everything lined up right when you want it, but if you just kind of keep plugging, you'll find great opportunities, and the BC network will really help you to do that.
That's very comforting to hear, I think, especially as a second semester senior with no real plan set up for next year. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we are going to open up the floor for any questions people might have now. It's obviously like a pretty small group, so if you want, you can just like unmute and ask a question. Also, if you want to send it in the chat, Mahima or I can like ask it out loud if that's easier. So yeah, take it away if people have any questions.
So you talked a little bit about your transition from an intern to an associate, but I just was wondering if you have any tips as to how you went from a paid intern to getting hired as an associate, or just the experience itself and that transition, how that went.
Yeah, it was sort of a surprise to me, I guess, in that there was no clear trajectory where it was like, oh, if you do this internship, we'll hire you. And it was supposed to run from September through the end of November, like beginning of December, basically. And, I was given a lot of substantive stuff to work on, so I felt like it would have been really valuable regardless. But then, towards the end of November, a kind of boss, pulled me in and said, look, we really like your work. Would you be interested in extending for, the next month? And then, an offer. So, and in some sense, I got lucky, I guess. In another sense, it shows that performance does matter at these things, and that it might not be immediately clear that there's an opening on the other end of it, but if you commit yourself to an opportunity like that and really kind of prove yourself, there might be. So yeah, that's the short of it, basically.
Looks like we just got a question in the chat from Izzy. She says, thank you so much, Sean. And she's wondering, once you actually have your job or internship, like, do you have any specific advice on how to make the most of the experience, and also how you can maintain a good work-life balance?
Yeah, so I would say, work-life balance, at least for me, has always been pretty manageable. There are probably jobs that have been other people have that might be more demanding, where you're kind of working around the clock. I was even at Blue Star, I was working like 9 to 6 Monday to Friday. That extra hour, you feel it a little bit. You kind of want to go home at 5, but ultimately it didn't infringe on my my sense of balance too much. And my bosses were always very good about like not making you work on weekends and that kind of thing. In terms of making the most of your experience, I also would recommend sort of looking at other professional networks that are related to whatever job you might be doing. In DC, there's like a ton of young professionals groups, networking groups. There was a group that I was involved in that was like young people who were interested in Russia and post-Soviet space, and I applied for that, and it was just kind of like a twice monthly thing where you meet up for happy hour and you meet other people who are kind of in the same field, and you can build some really good friendships out of that, as well as good professional contacts. So you don't want to live your job 24/7, but I think that even if you're just an intern, or starting at like an entry-level job, you can find ways to seek out these other professional networking opportunities that can be really valuable.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us today. I was wondering if there were certain pros or cons for waiting to go to grad school until later, after you've had some career experience.
Yeah, good question. I definitely wanted to get work experience first for a couple of reasons, and one of them was because I think I was tempted to go to grad school, but I didn't want to rush it, if I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And in fact, at least for the kind of school I'm in, which is a policy-focused school, 2-year master's program, they really want students who have worked for a couple of years and gotten, quote unquote, real world experience. So I definitely feel like that was an important formative thing for me to actually kind of get out there, sink or swim a little bit in the, in the workforce. On the other hand, all these decisions are individual. And if for instance, that you really want to go into academia, or, go for a PhD for some reason that's more academic focused, then there's a strong case to be made for just doing that right away. I think for me, I just knew I didn't necessarily want to go down that route. And I wanted to, work for a couple of years and then see what are the things that I, could grow on in school in a shorter program. So I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Sean. Great to see you again. Thanks for doing this with our crew today, and for all the folks who will watch this afterwards. It's great to have you back.
Great to be back. Yeah.
Quick question about your experience working in DC in a time of hyper partisanship. How did you manage that process? I mean, you worked in some sense for a partisan group, or a Blue Star, I assume, is working with a certain side of the fence, but I don't get the sense that partisanship is your thing. How did you function in that environment, and how did you make your way with any sort of difficult things that choices or decisions or projects that came your way that you felt might not reflect what you wanted to be doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's I've had a little bit of a weird experience in this regard, that I think a lot of DC people, you kind of pick your side, and that's where you are in your career track in a lot of ways going forward. Blue Star Strategies was a Democratic firm, basically, and run by two veterans of the Clinton administration. It was technically bipartisan in the sense that they had like a kind of a Republican on as a senior advisor, but it was clearly a Democratic firm, and that was largely a good alignment for me. But at the same time, I went to the American Interest. It was a nonpartisan magazine, but really had a reputation for being more center right. And of course, the Trump era throws out tons of questions about what does it mean to even be a center right publication. We came out, ultimately fairly strongly against Trump, which I would not have wanted to work there, I think, if we were kind of like a, very much like a Trump apologetic publication. But that said, there were some tensions regarding the editorial line. There were some people on board the team who were far more conservative than me personally. But what I would say is it actually was a really good learning experience and useful to me to sort of be in conversation with people who are have a slightly different political valence, and to kind of engage with some of my colleagues in the American Institute are some of the smartest kind of like center right, conservative writers out there. And I think it sharpened my my intellectual sparring skills in some sense, but also introduced me to a different set of arguments without feeling like I was being compromised by doing something I didn't believe in. So I would actually say that the ability to be in a couple of these different networks and not be exclusively on one side of the fence on all issues is actually really a good thing, and it's probably rarer than it should be in DC.
Okay, I don't know. Does anybody have any more questions? If not, we can just end here. Thank you so much, Sean, for coming and taking the time to speak with all of us today. I know that I learned a lot from hearing about your experiences, and I'm sure that everyone else can agree. Is there a way that students can reach out to you if they have any other questions that they didn't get the chance to ask today, or just want to connect?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say, I'll put my email in the chat. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and really, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to talk. It's kind of the paying it forward. I had a lot of people before me who helped me just, chat about different opportunities, and I'm always happy to do that. So yeah, there's my email in the chat, message me on LinkedIn, whatever you prefer, and I'll be happy to talk.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming. This is the first of a series of conversations. So like Grace said in the beginning, just keep an eye out for more of them in the newsletter that we send out.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. This was fun.